There's an old saying that amateurs study tactics, but professionals study logistics. First of all, let's talk about the armies themselves. One thing you need to understand about Civil War armies is that the largest army before 1861 was 15,000 men that Winfield Scott took to Mexico City, and also that George Washington had at Yorktown in 1781. So these armies are moving and existing on a scale far larger than anything that has ever been seen in the history of the United States. One thing that you need to understand about when these armies move is that when you look at a map, it shows a neat little symbol moving from place to place. But in reality, think of these as long, snake-like columns. To use a great example, when Stonewall Jackson marched 28,000 men around Joe Hooker's flank at Chancellorsville, the head of the column passed Lee's headquarters at 7 a.m., the tail of the column passed at 11. It took 4 hours for the men to pass a single point. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're not just talking about men that were moving around the battlefield. We're also talking about cannons, we're talking about cavalry, and we're talking about particularly horses and mules. And when you think about what it takes to feed these armies and to keep them going, because remember, fortune favors the bold, as long as they're not out of bread and bullets, what it takes to feed these guys also includes hay and provender for the horses. And it's not just food for the men and for their animals. It's also water. One of the quickest ways that you can reduce the combat capability of the unit is to deny them water. In the Kentucky campaign, which was fought in a very severe drought, every day of the campaign, the men on both sides started marching 1 mile less than the day before. The reason was dehydration. So dehydration sounds like a very simple thing, but it can have very profound impacts on a campaign and on a battlefield. The other thing to keep in mind is something called road space. When you think of a wagon, when you think wagon with a team of horses hitched to it, or a cannon with a team of horses hitched to it, it occupies the same amount of space on a road as a charter bus does, for example. There's an old fact that is often repeated, but people don't really think about it. It's that when U.S. Grant took so much supplies into the Wilderness Campaign that if you had stretched his wagon train end to end, it would have stretched for 64 miles. Well, think about that for just a second, that the Army has to maneuver and protect this essential piece of it as it moves. Double it up on the road, and it's still 32 miles in length. Now let's talk about some campaigns where logistics really made the difference. The first, perhaps the most dramatic of all the examples, is the campaign in New Mexico when the Confederates invaded in the summer of 1862. That campaign was over when the Confederates had their wagon train captured by Union forces. Their forces completely abandoned the invasion and never went back. Some other examples that come to mind? Well, let's return to the Kentucky campaign. In September of 1862, Braxton Bragg conquered the garrison, the 4,000-man garrison at Munfordville, and was between Don Carlos Buell's army and his main supply base at Louisville. But even though Bragg was in tactically a fantastic position, his quartermasters came to him and said, "Sir, if we stay here too much longer, we will starve." And it wasn't just the food. The area had been picked clean. It was also a very severe drought. The water was drying up. And so Bragg reluctantly had to abandon the position. July 3rd, 1863, Robert E. Lee's Army in Northern Virginia had only so much ordnance left available to it to support an infantry attack. That limited the duration and size of the Confederate preparatory bombardment before Pickett's charge, but it also limited the amount that the guns could support the infantry attack. Again, sounds like a small detail, but the logistics in this case arguably made a huge difference in the conduct of that attack. So when you think about these campaigns, never ever forget that they're not symbols on a map. They are men and animals that need to move, to fight, to eat, to perform to the best of their ability. And the logistics often determine the outcome of the campaign.